The topic of my talk is what right speech means in today's world, at least as I can best understand it. In a broader sense, I want to address the issue of good communication, both speaking and listening, and how living in an age of modern technology and a time of political chaos affects these. When I was a child, we used to chant, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me." I'm sure many of you can remember hearing that and perhaps saying it yourselves. Those of us who did chant that couldn't have been more wrong. Words as a primary mode of communication have tremendous power, and they can hurt us. And that is doubtless why right speech is the third component of the Eightfold Path in Buddhism and is one of the 5 Buddhist precepts for ethical conduct. The Buddha was precise in his description of right speech. He defined it as abstinence from false speech, abstinence from malicious speech, abstinence from profanity and harsh speech, and abstinence from idle chatter. In essence, this means not lying, not using speech to create discord among people, not speaking in a crude, cynical, or hostile tone of voice, and not engaging in gossip. As the Venerable Lee pointed out in her talk a few weeks ago, we're living in chaotic times right now. Indeed, my last Dharma talk was on the topic of how to survive and remain positive in the aftermath of the last presidential election. At that point, I talked about being realistic and in what we expect from our president, President Trump, and to be prepared for the worst. Unfortunately, I think most of us would agree that President Trump has lived up to our worst expectations. And while I could spend this whole talk making a list of the destructive things that the leader of our country has done in the first 6 months of his presidency, I'd rather focus on the way that he's used bad speech, bad communication to further his agenda. It would be hard, I would suggest, to find anyone in recent history who has more blatantly broken the 4 requirements of right speech as defined by the Buddha than Donald Trump. He has become a master of false speech, shamelessly speaking lie after lie, whether about the size of the crowd at his inauguration, the nature of his communications with his staff, the requirements of the Paris Accord on climate change, or more recently, what he did or didn't say to James Comey. Malicious speech has been his hallmark. Master Sotaesan said, "Do not blame others when something goes wrong, but examine yourself." Our president seems incapable of self-examination and is quick to blame everyone but himself for everything that goes wrong, and as we all know too well, an awful lot has gone wrong in the country in the last 6 months. As to not using harsh speech, I don't think Donald Trump knows any other way of speaking. He's like a cauldron of anger, suspicion, and negativity. And with his harsh speech, he has alienated so many people and so many of our allies. It was appropriate but sad to hear Angela Merkel say 2 weeks ago, after Trump's visit to Europe, Europe can no longer look to the United States as a reliable ally. That's quite a statement. No European leader has uttered such a statement since World War II. Then there's the 4th requirement of right speech, abstain from idle chatter. We have the embarrassing spectacle of our president's daily tweets, in which he says whatever comes to his mind, which is often cruel, thoughtless, and adolescent, but is there for the whole world to see. In short, in our president, we see the embodiment of everything that runs contrary to right speech. The worst possible example of poor communication, and might I even go so far as to say sometimes evil communication. Now, many of us, I think, have found great difficulty absorbing this. We find ourselves saying almost daily, "This can't be happening. The President of the United States cannot be saying, let alone doing, such horrible things." It feels like living in an alternate universe, a surreal experience. I've been a psychotherapist for more than 40 years, and in all that time, in all those years, I have never until this year, had clients who were obsessed with the political climate, and particularly with the frightening and disgusting behavior of the president. People are angry and afraid, and they don't know quite how to process it. Now, having said this much, which is enough, let me be clear, I don't want to spend this whole talk talking about Donald Trump. We see and hear too much about him daily as it is. But he clearly is a prime example, and perhaps the best on display, of poor, irresponsible communication, the very opposite of what the Buddha meant by right speech. The very existence and rise of President Trump may reflect, albeit in dramatic fashion, how communication has gone awry in our society. He could not have come as far as he has without the existence, on the one hand, of the media, which he loves to berate but cleverly uses and manipulates, and on the other hand, of social media, which he uses to his advantage every day. One of the reasons that so many people, I think, have become obsessed with the president is that the media have fed that obsession. Granted, much that is happening today in the White House is newsworthy, but the media have taken it to the ultimate extreme. And this is as true of MSNBC and CNN as it is of Fox News. And it is as true of the New York Times as it is of Breitbart. Following the media the last 6 months, you would have the impression that the world revolves around the White House and Donald Trump. Ivanka selling her clothing line makes the front page of the New York Times, while global struggles going on in other parts of the world are relegated to page 23. Now, we've been taught that if it's in the paper or on the news, it must be true. If it's on the front page of the Times, it must be really important. And if it's on page 23, it probably isn't so important. This is a kind of subtle brainwashing that I think most of us have subliminally been affected by. It affects how we think and how we respond, probably much more than we realize. This, I think, is a corporate effect of what the Buddha called idle chatter. It does the public a great disservice, I think, and directs our attention to the wrong places. I agree with Bill Moyers when he says that the news media today is largely bankrupt, driven by what will attract corporate sponsors, sell papers, and attract viewers, rather than a search for balance and truth. I really think we need to hold the media accountable and demand more responsible reporting. Right speech also means right reporting. Sotae-san says, study facts and principles and learn to discriminate between truth and falsehood, correctly judging right from wrong and advantage from disadvantage. I think those in the media would do well to follow this admonition. Meanwhile, social media has also created its own set of problems. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Snapchat, etc. These are, in and of themselves, morally neutral. They offer the opportunity for a tremendous sharing of information on a level the world has never known before. But there's also the danger of misuse and abuse of these media. Donald Trump certainly exemplifies this in his use of lies and false information touted as the truth on his Twitter account, which is followed by tens of millions of people every day. But he's not alone in abusing this medium. While social media offers a wonderful place to share information, to maintain meaningful relationships and friendships, to affirm collegiality, it also can become a place to vent anger, resentment, and negativity. Now, some of that, believe me, I think is certainly understandable and probably appropriate given the political climate. But we're receiving so much negativity from Washington and the news that I'm not sure we're doing anybody any favors, or ourselves, by mirroring that in what we post on social media. The Buddha talked of right speech as abstinence from malicious and harsh speech. And that would apply to speech that reflects our hatred and resentment about what is happening in Washington. Now, this is a tough one, and one I have to admit that personally I have difficulty with and should be more mindful about. In this tense and negative atmosphere, we really need to find, I think, a better balance, a difficult balance, with more emphasis on the things we love and affirm, and in what we post on our social media, lest we succumb to cynicism and negativity, which is a real threat today. This is a difficult challenge that I think we face right now, and it's difficult not to give in to anger and negativity in the current climate. Technology in general, I think, creates both opportunities and traps when it comes to right speech, to mindful communication. In some ways, technology is both a blessing and a curse, depending on how we use it. On the plus side, it has made things so much easier and more convenient. It saves us time and energy, and it makes the world a much smaller place when each of us literally has the ability to communicate with almost anyone else in the world instantly. That's amazing. And in a positive sense, the very existence of the internet allows the sharing of all news and opinions without censorship, a place to rebut and challenge the corporate media. And this is all to the good. But on the negative side, technology may make us lazy and sloppy in how we communicate. When I stand on the corner of 72nd Street and Broadway each day after work, waiting for the number 5 bus to take me home, I'm struck as I look around me at how virtually everyone standing there, with few exceptions, are doing something on their cell phones. They are oblivious to their environment and to what is going on around them. And as the bus then heads up Riverside Drive, and often there's a beautiful sunset appearing over the Hudson, I often have the sense that I am literally the only person on that bus who's aware of the sunset. Everyone else is playing with their smartphones. The very existence of the smartphone can distract us from an awareness of nature and the environment that surrounds us. It also can make us less present to one another. How many times have you sat in a restaurant and noticed how people have their cell phone either on the edge of the table or on their lap, where they can glance at it every few moments to see what's going on there? And they do that without being fully present to the people with whom they are conversing. This is a topic that comes up a lot in the marriage counseling that I do these days. I can't tell you how many times I've heard one or the other in marriage counseling say, he or she is more interested in their blankety-blank phone than in me. Another problem area that has risen within the advent of smartphones, I think, is the nature of the communication that is occurring on these phones. The primary mode of communication used by many, if not most, of the younger generation, that is many of you too, is text messaging. My youngest clients and my grandchildren tell me that they seldom even use email anymore, and they rarely talk on the phone. They text. Texting is convenient, and it certainly has its pluses. It's great for sharing, for signaling help in a crisis. It's great for alerting someone when you're late to an appointment. It's great for lighthearted banter. But is it really a good medium for serious or intimate communication? When you're speaking with someone face to face, you not only hear the words, you hear the tone of voice. You see the body language and the facial expression. You get a full picture of what is being said. When you're just reading the words on a phone, a whole lot is lost. Now, often my counseling clients will share text messages with me that they've sent or received from their significant others, often in the midst of crises. And what strikes me again and again is the constant danger of miscommunication because the words may not adequately reflect the tone that was intended in these communications. So there's a lot, I think, to be said for face-to-face communication, or at the very least, telephone voice communication, when we want to reach out to those who mean a lot to us. Without the voice, the face, the tone, there's only so much real connection that can occur between two people. I think the jury is out as to what effect this form of communication, when it is the primary mode as it is for so many younger people today, what effect this will have over the long term. Will these people be better or worse communicators 20 or 30 years from now? for having used this technology? Or will they perhaps have lost the ability to take in and interpret face-to-face communication, and thereby be less skilled at connecting intimately with others? I fear that that could happen, but I certainly hope and pray that it doesn't. I realize that being one of the few people I know who does not own a cell phone, let alone a smartphone, I'm looking in at this from the outside and may not be seeing it really clearly. Or maybe I'm seeing it more clearly because I am looking in from the outside. I'm not sure. And doubtless there will come the day when I too will get a smartphone. I'm sure of that. I was one of the last among my friends to get a computer some 30 years ago. And now I suffer from the same obsessions with my computer that I see others doing with their cell phones. The temptation is great. It's there constantly. I think technology is wonderful. It's here to stay. Technological changes that affect communication are occurring so quickly that I don't think we can begin to imagine what it will be like even 5 or 10 years from now. There's no turning the clock back on this. But the challenge that we face is how to maintain a sense of balance, how to use technology wisely and responsibly without being governed or obsessed with it. That's no easy task, but I think it's one that we all face daily. And here is where hopefully our spiritual practice can be helpful. When we meditate, hopefully we clear our minds of computer and smartphone screens. We achieve some distance from all of our obsessions and temptations. We learn to listen to what is going on within us from the deepest part of our being. And I would suggest that that enables us to better listen to others. We think of right speech as primarily how we speak and what we say. But listening is also an important component of right speech. I would suggest that when we don't listen mindfully, we can't speak mindfully. How often when we're engaged in a stimulating conversation do we find ourselves focusing on what we're going to say next rather than listening really to what the other person is saying? I know that I do this far too much, and I don't like it. It often can become a kind of one-upmanship or a way of trying to impress. And in the process, a real connecting with those with whom we are conversing can be broken. The author, Rachel Naomi Remen, wisely said, "The most basic and powerful way to connect to another person is to listen. Just listen. Perhaps the most important thing we ever give each other is our attention." She continues, "A loving silence often has far more power to heal and to connect than the most well-intentioned words." I love that quote. There's so much wisdom there. In this technological age and this very busy city, let's face it, we tend to get wound up, manic. We speak too quickly, we say too much. And idle chatter too often replaces deeper communication. I do think that meditation as a practice helps us to become better listeners, because we then begin by listening to our own inner selves and to the universe. The Catholic philosopher Simone Weil, way back in the 1940s, talked about prayer as a form of listening. She suggested that while most prayer is prayer of supplication or affirmation, we need to see and practice prayer as listening. Listening quietly to what God may have to say to us. Or as Buddhists, listening to what the universe has to say, the God or Buddha that is within us speaking to us. I think it makes a lot of sense that when we become better listeners, we become better communicators. Our speech becomes less dominated by the ego and more in tune with the deeper inner self. In this chaotic time which we are living, this divisive and often hostile political climate, I think it's particularly important that we learn how to be better listeners. Not only with those whom we love and trust, but especially with those with whom we disagree and even sometimes see as adversaries. And that's a particular issue, I think, in this political climate. In the aftermath of the presidential election, many of us found ourselves feeling angry, betrayed, afraid. As I said here shortly after the election, Those feelings are all appropriate, they're understandable. But you know, there's a kind of dictum in psychology that I subscribe to 100%, which says, we are not responsible for what we feel. We don't plan what we're going to feel. Our feelings come upon us. But we are responsible for what we do with those feelings, how we express them, and the actions that they lead to. And that has strong implications for right speech, for responsible, mindful speech. The recent election led not only to divisions within the society and political parties, but within many families. What are you to do when you've planned a holiday, maybe July 4th, with family members, parents, uncles, maybe old high school or college friends who over the years maybe have drifted from you to the opposite end of the political spectrum, may even have voted for Donald Trump? You may be feeling a lot of anger and resentment at these people. Is it better just to avoid them? Sometimes I think that might be wise when you don't trust yourself not to engage in the kind of harsh, condemning speech that the Buddha warns us against. But in general, I think we have to be very careful not to too quickly write these people off, especially if we have a history with them, and much of that history has been a pleasant one. Here is where I think Raymond's words on listening can be helpful. We may find it much more helpful to approach those with whom we disagree, not with the anticipation of hostile interaction, because they don't want that any more than we do, and not with the agenda of changing how they think, because we're not going to be able to do that, but with an intention of listening better to them, of really listening and trying to hear where they're coming from. And this probably means initially talking mainly about things other than politics today. Uncle Fred, what really turns you on? What arouses your passions? What do you really enjoy in life? What great memories do you have, the things you've achieved, that you've done in your life? How often do we have this discussion? The writer Alain de Botton, who has written much about healthy relationships, suggests that the best place to begin when approaching those with whom we disagree is with the understanding that we both are scarred and damaged in different ways. Uncle Fred, this is my craziness. What is yours? If my goal is to change you, this is not going to work because it will be driven by ego rather than love. A relationship based on love and compassion, suggests Botton, is driven by a mutual desire to, quote, teach each other how to become the best versions of ourselves. Teach each other how to become the best versions of ourselves. I like that. I like it a lot. It mirrors the words of Felix Adler, the founder of the ethical culture movement, who said that the ethical dictum which should govern all relationships is, quote, elicit the best in others, thereby eliciting the best in ourselves. Again, elicit the best in others, thereby eliciting the best in ourselves. What we say to those with whom we disagree and how we say it becomes very important, I think, in determining whether we're able to achieve what both de Botton and Adler are suggesting. It means being mindful of what right speech means in those situations. Avoiding harsh and malicious speech, I think, needs to become a kind of mantra when we are with those whom we perceive as adversaries. It's not an easy task, definitely not. But I think it's doable if we make it our goal to listen and understand the other rather than to change him or her, which we're tempted to do. The old dictum, think before you speak, can be very helpful here. One Buddhist teaching says, when you're inclined to speak in anger, take 3 deep breaths before you speak. Just taking the few seconds to do that can bring us back to our deeper self, the compassionate, balanced self that lies beneath the ego and its anger and self-righteousness. Achieving right speech is never easy, and I think it's particularly difficult in the chaotic political atmosphere in which we find ourselves today. That's the challenge I think we live with every day right now. I know that I do. We need to turn to our spiritual practice more than ever and helping us, I think, to meet that challenge. I really do believe that to the extent that we can achieve this, that we can speak more with compassion and less from fear and anger. The more that we can do this, we can hope to become agents of positive change in a time when far too many people are devoid of positive expectations. Thank you for letting me share these thoughts with you today.